Welcome, welcome. My name is Lloyd Borrell. I'm your host. Today, I'm thrilled to have as my guest Dr. Zach Bush. Dr. Zach is one of the few triple board certified physicians in the US with expertise in internal medicine, endocrinology, and metabolism, and hospice and palliative care. His education efforts provide a grassroots foundation from which we can launch change in legislative decisions, ultimately shifting consumer behavior to bring about radical change in the mega industries of big farming, big pharma, and Western medicine. Dr. Zach Bush, welcome to the EMF Health Summit.
I'm so glad to be here. Thank you, Lloyd.
Well, I'm genuinely thrilled to have you on because your work is so relevant. And, usually I start by asking my guests how they became interested in electromagnetic fields. But in your case, it seems more appropriate to start by asking you, how do you get interested in cells and cell biology? Yeah. So maybe we could start there for a change.
Very good. I was actually heading into a career in engineering and then took a year off of school and went over to the Philippines and had an opportunity to work with some midwives over there birthing babies. And so that's how I got first interested in the human cells and the mind-blowing experience of watching babies born and being a part of that, and then seeing babies, not thriving and dying in these poor communities was a huge, eye-opener into the drama of human life, if you will. And so that was my entry point. And then, I actually didn't really enjoy school that much growing up. I was more into building cars and houses than I was doing schoolwork. And so it wasn't until I found myself in medical school that I actually found my stride academically, and just suddenly everything started making sense. I think I was getting really excellent instruction for the first time in my life. And so it was a very exciting thing. Gross anatomy was an incredible experience that really kind of enlightened me to the fact that there was a universe under the skin, and the scale of the knowledge base that it would take to start to even come close to mastering that body really came into focus, I think, through my gross anatomy time, and that got me intrigued about the potential for communication between the systems. When you think of a fetus growing, you've got this single cell. Life starts in a cell that's similar to a cancer cell in the sense that there's no differentiation. It just starts replicating itself. There's no liver, there's no kidney, there's no brain. It's just a single cell replicating like a tumor. And then suddenly around the 250 cell division mark, the human body suddenly starts to differentiate, and suddenly a cell somehow knows that it's going to become a spinal cord or a brain or a kidney or a liver. That was magical to me, and I think remains to this day for most doctors and scientists a black box scientifically. Like, how in the hell does a single cell really do what it does to become a 70 trillion celled organism that functions in such incredible coordination? So that was my slippery slope, and in some ways that ties right into our communication that we can talk about around the EMF thing, which is much of the EMF concerns these days around cell phones. But interestingly, cell phones are built on wireless communication, which is now a very good description of the biochemistry and cell biology that I do, which is really studying how does one cell talk to a distant cell without a neurologic system, without a neuron or some other mechanism in between. And so that's become one of my areas of passion and expertise is how does information travel through the human body and its complexity, and how has that gone awry? We see a chronic disease burden that's never been witnessed in human history hitting all of the industrial nations of the world. And so we see this enormous collapse of human health, and that fundamentally has to have something to do with this cell-cell communication because it's affecting so many different organ systems simultaneously. We saw an uptick, vertical rise in cancer, heart disease, the neurologic conditions, the autism to Alzheimer's to Parkinson's, all these conditions all started to go and increase their mortality, over the course of the 1990s and 2000s. And so, that's kind of my background and kind of the slippery slope of intellectual pursuit that got me to the point where I am today, if that makes some sense.
Yeah. So it's all about the cell, clearly. And yeah, I love what you say there. You know, each cell is a universe into itself, and it is very intriguing. And what you're saying is very intriguing, and I find it very intriguing too. I've looked into this also, but not nearly as much depth as you. And also, it's interesting what you're saying about the communication, about this parallel between the cells and what we're talking about, well, a lot of people, on a lot of people's minds, particularly now with 5G, is cellular communication, as in cell phones and cell towers. And it is kind of weird that we're using the same terms even, although there's probably a very logical explanation for that. But so, yeah, it's the cell is really important. And when we talk about health and when we think about health, really, we have to, at some point, we have to go back to the cell and look at the cell and study the cell. So in a sense, and we're not doing that particularly, I think, you know, most doctors aren't doing that. There is a growing interest in this, but it's not kind of generally accepted by any means. But so in a way, it seems like we can say, you know, and you're linking it to these diseases, which are just, you know, out of control, chronic diseases, which are just, you know, off the charts. So could we say that this is a new paradigm for understanding disease? You know, this loss of cell-to-cell communication?
Yeah, absolutely. A cell that has unfettered access to information never gets sick. A cell that has access to information has all of the machinery for cell repair all day long. In addition, if that cell machinery for repair gets damaged too much to do its work, then the cell has many mechanisms by which to turn on cell suicide processes while calling in stem cells to replace it with new cell. And so we have these multiple levels of intrinsic health and repair mechanisms within the body. The only thing that stops that from happening is a loss of communication. If the cell starts to have a difficulty time sensing or being aware of injury within itself or within its surroundings, then its machinery doesn't kick into action, and you can start to get an accumulation of damage and unrepaired injury within the cell. Now you start to move down that slippery slope towards cancer. Cancer is kind of the end point, if you will, of internal cellular damage that's not being repaired. Just at the genetic level, of course, there's injury at the protein level, there's cell membrane level, the mitochondrial level, which is the production of energy within the cell, as well as cell communication internally. But then if you go all the way down to the nucleus of the cell where we hold all of our DNA, you can get a sense of how much accumulated damage is in the cell. A common cancer cell will have between 20,000 and 25,000 unrepaired injuries to the DNA within its nucleus. And so these are extremely damaged cells that even in that cancer state still have the machinery available to go and fix all of that DNA, build new proteins, build new cell membrane, rebuild the whole structure, but that machinery is sitting silent. Aging is another more common version of this. 100% of humans in history have aged. The aging process is one in which you have this steady loss of cell-cell communication and intracellular within the cell communication, and so you get that accumulation of damage. And so skin cells stop regenerating, skin cells stop repairing the elastin, which is the stretchy part. It stops laying down collagen, and so we get wrinkles and we get baggy skin, and all of this is signs and symptoms of first cell-cell communication loss and then subsequently dehydration and loss of energy production from the mitochondria. So those are kind of the three pieces of aging, and it all ties into ultimately this awareness of the cell. A cell that's plugged into that wireless network, all the cell phone towers are up and running, that person's never going to get sick. And you see this in your environment, right? You know people who never get the flu or never, they cruise through the wintertime, never get a sniffle. And then the guy at the desk next to him at work is always got chronic draining sinuses, and anybody comes in sick, that guy's going to get it, And so we can just see in even our micro day-to-day lives that there's vast difference in the resilience of the biology from person to person based on ultimately how connected are they to this inherent intrinsic repair system up and running.
And how efficiently and effectively that is running. And so that leads to the question of, where do electromagnetic fields fit into this picture? What these man-made, electromagnetic fields generally in the cell, perhaps you could speak to that, and then this aspect of these man-made frequencies, where that fits in, what they're doing.
Yeah. The reason I think that one of the main reasons that EMFs have not been studied in mainland area of science is because it's a jump out of cell biology into biophysics. Doctors suck at physics. That's why they become doctors. If they were good at math, they would go be engineers and make more money or something. But doctors are inherently better at the soft sciences than they are at the hard sciences typically, and so that kind of picks our career path. There's obviously exceptions to that, but as a general, so now you have a field of highly educated individuals who are all thinking in the soft sciences, and these hard mathematicians and physicists over there, they talk in quantum physics and all this stuff, and that just sounds like gobbledygook to the typical medical doctor's brain. And so for us, it's difficult for us to perceive how could a frequency generating thing like a radio frequency or a microwave frequency coming out of a cell phone have any relationship to this very Newtonian kind of belief system that we have about the human cells, these big kind of machines that run, and you can go and look at a mitochondria under the microscope, or you can look at a cell membrane and say, here are the components, and here's a damaged component, and we can replace that. Or, so we live in a very concrete belief system in cell biology. And that's why cell biology has been so limited historically, is because ultimately we are not solid. We are actually all vacuum space, right? And so if you look at the real physics of a cell, well, the body's not made of cells, it's made of molecules, and those molecules are ultimately made of atoms, and the atoms are made of protons and electrons, and mostly vacuum space. And so the atoms by which we are built are 99.999% vacuum space, 0.001% solid. And so by nature, everything around you, your body, the table you're sitting at, all of that stuff that looks solid is 0.001% solid, 99.999% frequency. It's electromagnetic frequency that's resonating in that vacuum space that defines what the solid looks like. The reason the table looks different than the back of your hand is because the vacuum space is vibrating. It has a different frequency resonance, and so it's structuring the 0.01% of it differently. And that gives us this perception of solidity, and it gives us a perception of uniqueness in our fabric. But in reality, everything from a leaf to a crystal to the desk you're sitting at, to your hand, to your liver, all of that is made from an identical fabric at the vacuum space level. It's all electromagnetic field resonance. So in that way, this is where the cell phones, Wi-Fi routers, Bluetooth, all of this wireless communication that we're now surrounded ourselves with in the last 20 years becomes concerning of like, wow, if we're all vacuum space and we're more atomic frequency resonance than we are solid, what does that mean for the biology? And we're just starting to wrap our heads around this. And some of the current data is starting to look at its effect on some of the machinery. And so our group is starting to look at the calcium channels that are on the surface of cells and the effect of cell phones on those calcium channels, because this is one of the most fundamental portals, if you will, into a human cell, regulates most of its function, not only in repair, but in manufacturing of equipment, and all kinds of stuff is controlled by these calcium channels. And so we're working to really prove out that cell phones at 3G, 4G, 5G can all affect these calcium channels and screw up intracellular signaling. So that's like one avenue, but that's just like a micro piece of it. The other side of our research, where we really began this journey, was looking at the extracellular matrix, which is the scaffolding, if you will, or that connects cells and holds cells in coherent structure. You can imagine, your house, for example, being suddenly stripped of the framework within the walls. Suddenly you have floppy drywall, you have siding that's falling off, the shingles are collapsing, the whole house is starting to fall apart, and yet you have all of the components there. The drywall is there, the dryer and washer is still there, your washing machine is still in place, your sinks are in, your plumbing's in, your electrical's in. It looks like everything is still there, and yet without the framework, the whole system would collapse very, very quickly. That's the extracellular matrix effect on the human body. If we were to strip away your extracellular matrix, the cells would collapse. They would be unable to hold themselves up. But more importantly, it gets back to this communication piece, is if we destroy the extracellular matrix, we lose the fiber optic cables from one cell to the next. And this is a big deal. The fiber optic cables are called gap junctions. Gap junctions sit behind the tight junction barrier system. So tight junctions are kind of the Velcro, dynamic Velcro system that allows material to pass between cells to enter the body, for example. So your gut is your largest exposure to the outside world. It covers 2 tennis courts in surface area. It's made of billions of these little tiny cells that are all laced together by tight junctions to make one coherent membrane or carpet, if you will. And then that's supposed to intelligently keep stuff out or allow stuff in. You want nutrients to come in, you want water to come in, but you want the chemicals and heavy metals and other junk to stay out. That intelligent barrier system is held together by tight junctions, and so that's the gatekeeper. But sitting behind that Velcro is the fiber optic cable system in these gap junctions. If under electron microscopy, they look like cables. You've seen a cable, it's maybe an inch around, but it's made of thousands and thousands of tiny thread-like steel pieces. Well, in contrast to a cable, if you look at a gap junction, if you keep zooming in under electron microscopy, you find out that every one of those threads is hollow and is actually a tube that has a light aperture at the end of every single tube. That's mind-blowing. These are down at like fractions of a human hair. So you're down, these cables that run between your cells are like a 10th to 100th of the scale of the width of a human hair. So these are tiny, tiny microscopic fibrils that are passing light energy from one cell to the next, which makes sense because ultimately you need self-identity at the cell level to be coherent, whether you're in the liver, the kidney, the brain. All of those cells, while having much different structure and function, have to be resonating to, in my case, Zach. I need to wake up every day and every single cell needs to know it's part of Zach and it's in conjunction with 70 trillion other cells to make me work for me. I've never woken up and been like, oh, I'm Lloyd. It just doesn't happen, like we have this intrinsic, cellular identity that is, I think, dictated by this fiber optic system that's resonating, passing light energy so that everybody is in coherent resonance. We now have a lot of chemicals in our environment. The most common one now in our food chain and water system is Roundup or glyphosate. Glyphosate is the active ingredient in that Roundup weed killer that's on the shelf of every Home Depot and Lowe's and home improvement center, and is on the vast majority of consumer shelves and garages throughout the world. That chemical breaks the extracellular matrix up. And so this has been an area of expertise for our lab, is studying the effect of these Roundup chemicals on the cellular matrix. To find out that we've added to our food and water system a chemical that destroys that is kind of distressing, especially when simultaneously in human history, we add 3G, then 4G, then 5G communication. Now we're lysing the communication network within my system and adding exogenous frequency resonance that's not me to my body. That's my big concern. If we just had one or the other, we might not be as bad off, but we did them both at the same time. We screwed up the extracellular matrix and the fiber optic cable system and then bombarded the cells with outside information and frequency resonance, which changes water structure. Water is this incredible quantum physics molecule that is the translator between biophysics and cell biology. And when water structure changes, it changes the hydration capacity of the inside of the cell, which changes the ability of the cell to detox, which leads to more and more accumulation of injury within the cell. It slows down metabolism, and we would see, if I'm right that all of this stuff would happen under the force of Roundup chemicals and cell phone towers, then we should see an enormous amount of chronic disease crop up in the form of autoimmune disease, where our immune system starts to get confused about who we are. Instead of just attacking the outside world, we start to attack our own body as if it was foreign. Some 25% of young girls at age 12 in the United States already have antibodies to their own thyroid gland. 25%. And so 1 in 4 girls already destroying her own body out of confusion of who is she, what's outside, what's inside. That's pure evidence right there that we are destroying these barrier systems of self-identity, and we're bombarding the system with confusion of signaling at both, which ultimately has to get down to the atomic level. It can't be that, we just screwed up a cell at the mechanical part and therefore we have thyroid disease. No, it has to be down, because we're made of atoms, not cells, down in the atomic structure, the 99.99%, the frequency resonance of our electromagnetic field is getting screwed up by our current environment. Not just cell phones, but the chemical environment, the food environment, the water environment, all of this compounding to the perfect storm.
Yeah, the perfect storm. We've talked with previous guests. We've talked about the perfect storm. We always seem to be coming back to that. And different experts have got different views on what's the most important element of this perfect storm. But everybody seems to be pretty much agreed that EMFs are a big part, or they're a part of this perfect storm. Some people are saying they're a big part of it. I know there's a paper by Stephen Genui, I believe it's called, who was saying that when you've got all these toxins and then you add EMFs into it, then we get this kind of synergistic effect where all these chemical, it's an explosion of non-beneficial effects. Yeah, it's an explosion. It's just a massive explosion, very detrimental to our health. So you said a lot there, obviously, and it's interesting, So yeah, obviously the Newtonian mechanical model, that's out the window. It's finished, and we're still, most doctors, and the medical establishment, that's what's accepted, but it clearly just doesn't.
And it's totally screwing up the progress, right? Because you're right that the Newtonian model is theoretically out the window. We can prove that it's not accurate, it's not complete. But the problem is funding. In the United States in particular, 99% of our funding goes into chronic disease management and chronic disease treatments, rather than what is the fabric of health. How does health happen in the human body? What is a healthy human body at its fabric level? There's no research being done there because it's not being funded, not because it's not interesting. It's fascinating. It's the most compelling stuff I've ever done, but I had to create enough companies and enough profit centers to be able to fund back our own lab. So we have our own lab now that's internally funded that allows us to ask all kinds of interesting questions. But I didn't have that luxury in 17 years of academia. I could never ask any question I wanted. I had to ask questions that were compelling in an area that could get funded. And so the funding is channeled obviously all by the pharmaceutical and hospital industries. And so if you can't tie yourself to the profit margins, you can't get the money, you can't do the research. And so that has been the roadblock to progress in the United States. And so this is why, a lot of people think, well, EMF and, for that matter, chemical exposure, Roundup, all that science must be, kind of bunk science, or it must be, conspiracy theory. Because if all of it was that toxic, then certainly the universities would have figured that out by now. And the answer is no, they won't. They can't figure it out because they're not getting paid to figure it out. And so they can't. How could they possibly do it? There's a perception that universities are all publicly funded and have all this money. There's no publicly funded money flowing in any area of wellness. All of the public money is through the National Institutes of Health in the United States, which is all disease-based, to the degree that the NIH has actually broken into different different sectors. And so there's the NIDDK, which is just the section of the National Institutes of Diabetes and Kidney Disease. And so you've got this, sector within it. And so I had to put a lot of my research in there, but some of my research didn't fit into the NIDDK. And so then I was reaching over to another segment of the NIH to try to get funding over there, but they're all disease-based. They even define themselves as disease management funding sites. And there's a prevention and kind of piece within the NIH, and it represents a tiny fraction of the overall budget for the National Institutes of Health. And none of it is really going towards basic science of prevention. It's going towards public health, education things and things like that, but it's not going to what at the fabric level is human health coming out of. So we're broken at a funding level, and therefore we've got to stop hoping and expecting that academia is going to solve the problem. And we need to start as consumers trusting third-party watchdog organizations to say, hey, we've got a problem here, and we need to educate the consumer as to why that's a problem and prove it out. And so we need to really get that whole thing functioning. And so we're building an IT platform right now. One of my companies is a software company. We're building an IT platform where we can connect private monies to those private interest development environments so that, somebody with a good idea on how to not only diagnose EMF toxicity, but then ameliorate and fix that problem in the human cell, that needs to get funded. And we have a lot of people now, millions of people in the United States and worldwide, that have already diagnosed and recognized in themselves that they are EMF sensitive. Migraine syndromes, chronic fatigue, chronic pain syndrome, all of these, kind of ubiquitous now conditions that were never even described in the medical literature in the 1980s have now become ubiquitous and now are kind of the leading causes of complaints in any primary care office and anywhere in the developed world. I had never heard of chronic fatigue syndrome in the early 1990s when I was training, and certainly fibromyalgia wasn't part of the picture at that point. It was just way, way different in 1990 than it is today. So, I think that's part of the reality that you're helping push the ball uphill is we need these podcasts, we need these things to start the motion going, but then we need to create funding environments to prove the science out. We can prove on a populations that we're getting sicker. Now in our lab, we're really working to prove out this is what happens to a single human cell when it's exposed to these electromagnetic fields. And this is why, this is the smoking gun, if you will, to why we're seeing population health collapse.
Yeah. And it's like the world is really not what it seems, because wherever you look, and a lot of it is because, as you're saying, because we're not getting the science, the studies are not being done because of this funding problem. And so the information which is out there is not the right information, it's out-of-date information, it's just completely wrong. So we do need to get this information out. But I want to talk to you because you mentioned about voltage-gated calcium channels, which we've talked about a lot too. Dr. Martin Paul's work, obviously. But there's another aspect of how, what EMFs, this impact that EMFs have on our health. And that's with, as I understand it, the what we call the microbiome, and how perhaps EMFs, these electromagnetic fields, these non-native, from cell phones and Wi-Fi and smart meters and all the rest of it, how they're perhaps disrupting this bacterial communication. So perhaps if you could, because it is perhaps not very easy for everybody who's watching, it's just quite complex. So perhaps you could just start explaining what the microbiome is, and then how EMFs perhaps are affecting that.
So the microbiome is a term that's come out over the last 10 years to describe the ecosystem of non-human cells that live within you and on you. And so the realization now is that for every human cell, there are 10 bacteria that live in, on, or around you. And so that's a pretty astonishing number. That's 1.4 quadrillion organisms. And so you have 50 to 70 trillion cells. There's 1.5 quadrillion bacteria roughly. So you've got this massive ecosystem that scales way larger than the humans, and that's just talking about the bacteria. We look at the parasites, we have even a bigger kingdom there. So in the world of the bacteria, we probably have somewhere around 20 to 40,000 species that would be pertinent to human health. We have somewhere around 300,000 species of parasites. There's over 5 million species of fungi. There's 10 to the 31, that's a 1 with 31 zeros after it. It's too large of a number to ever have been named, viruses on the earth. So there's so much non-human life in the invisible world that's in and around you that's actually changing who you are minute to minute, second to second through genetics. And so it turns out that the microbiome has a much larger genome than humans. We only have 20,000 genes as a human. The viruses, for example, or I'm sorry, we don't even know how many of the viruses have yet, but the fungi, 5 million species of fungi have 125 trillion genes. And so 125 trillion versus 20,000 human genes. So we're so vastly outnumbered genetically. We used to think that those were separate, that the genes and DNA within a fungi would never affect the genes and DNA within a human cell. Well, we now know that's not true. First, there was epigenetics, but then more recently, there's a field called microRNA. MicroRNA are the little tiny proteins, or the little tiny nucleotide sequences that don't go on to make a protein. Our genes will make a strip of RNA that goes to make a protein that becomes part of that Newtonian machine that's running and repairing itself and building structure and all that. Only 1% of your genome, only 1% of your DNA will ultimately go on to make an RNA and a protein. The other 99% we thought was junk. We literally called it junk DNA. And then we find out a few years ago that, in fact, that's making these microRNA. And the microRNA are another communication network, this time between the genes rather than through the biochemistry. The microRNA can leave a cell, go into the bloodstream, can be excreted in our saliva, in our urine, can be secreted in the stool, can be secreted, in fact, in our breath. And so we've got these microparticles that can go and land on something near us, and then those microRNA can go into the nucleus of another species and change the behavior of the genes within that species. And so we're finding out that there is trans-species genetic plasticity happening across the ecosystem. And this is an astounding, bizarre reality that we're not human. We're a living ecosystem. And if we use and steep ourselves in antibiotics, we're going to die quicker. And that's exactly what we see. With every single antibiotic exposure you have in your life expectancy goes down. And so the more you kill your microbiome and that ecosystem through chemical sterilization, all the alcohol, hand sanitizers, and all this crap that's put into the system, we sterilize that down to the state where we can't be human because we've lost the ecosystem itself, and we're suffering chronic disease for that. So that's broad brushstrokes of a very, very big topic, but that I think answers your question to some degree there.
It sounds like science fiction, honestly, when you're explaining this.
Yeah.
Like, I don't know why I'm thinking of that movie, Avatar. It just sounds like, oof.
Avatar's it.
Than life. It just sounds unbelievable. And I mean, I've heard this kind of thing before, not quite explained like that, but it just does sound unbelievable. And I mean, already just the fact that what we think our reality and what, that this desk is solid and this glass here is solid and, that I'm solid and that we're not. I mean, just already that is pretty wow, but how can that be? But it is solid and, but when you look down, it's like 99.9% nothing when you go below into the subatomic level. So it is mind-blowing. It is mind-blowing, all this.
I can tie it back then. We should tie back the microbiome to the communication story. And so the microbiome is, we've been recognizing correlation in science since about 2005. So in 2005, we started to work on decoding the genome of the microbiome and the bacteria. And we started to realize that there was a correlation between the bacteria found in humans in their stool and the diseases that they were manifesting. To the degree that by 2008, 2010, UCSF, UCSD, these universities out in California were really starting to map this out pretty well and say, wow, if you're missing these bacteria, you're likely to get breast cancer. If you have too many of these bacteria, you're likely to get prostate cancer, et cetera. So we're seeing these correlations between the microbiome and human disease. And that, like you say, was like science fiction, mind-blowing. At that time, I was actually developing chemotherapy at the University of Virginia. That was my area of interest in research, was understanding cell suicide in cancer cells and how to turn that on with chemotherapy kind of agents. And so to me, as a cancer researcher, this sounded like complete bunk. It was like, okay, they found a correlation, but certainly not causation. Well, you just fast forward 3 to 5 years, suddenly by 2014, we starting to see, no, this is real. Like this is, if you lose these bacteria, cancer develops. We didn't have a mechanism yet, and that's what our lab has been working on, is what is the mechanism by which the microbiome is dictating human health or disease? And that mechanism is, again, coming down to cell-cell communication. I described for you the extracellular matrix. It's been a bit of a mystery as to how that extracellular matrix maintains itself and regulates that extracellular environment. It's not been an area of study at all, really. Whereas inside the cell, my research and many labs around the world for the last couple of decades have been focused on the mitochondria. The mitochondria look like bacteria, actually. They look like a double-walled bacteria that live inside your cells, and their DNA is much different than human DNA. They have their own DNA genomics, and they can divide and replicate inside your cells just like bacteria divide and replicate outside your cells. And so the mitochondria are like our inside the cell microbiome, if you will. There's 3 different species of mitochondria that all work together and do different things and all of that. So you've got this intracellular species variation that's non-human, that's taking care of that human intracellular environment, and it does it through something called redox molecules. The word redox is the words reduction and oxidation put together. Reduction is the passage of an electron or the addition of electron to a biochemical event. Oxidation is the tearing away or absorption of electron from a biochemical event. And so what I just described was electron transfer, which is back to electricity, which is back to light energy, which is back to the fabrics of the atomic structure of the human body, being dictated by mitochondria, which are non-human. Holy cow, the human doesn't make its own communication network to do intracellular communication. So that was my area of interest and expertise in the cancer world. And then I departed in 2010 to start a nutrition center because I started to realize that there actually isn't a single cancer on the planet that's ever been caused by a lack of chemotherapy. And so with that realization, it's like, oh, maybe I'm kind of going down the wrong angle here. We have a cancer epidemic which can't be caused by a lack of chemotherapy. So maybe it's a lack of something else, maybe a lack of nutrition. And so that was kind of my slippery slope towards exiting academia, starting a nutrition center, which got me studying nutrition for the first time in my life, which ultimately got me studying plants, which got me studying soil, and that got me studying microbiome. And that kind of closed the loop because we found these molecules in soil that looked like big macro versions of the redox molecules from the mitochondria. And that was the aha moment, is that bacteria and fungi don't have mitochondria, but would need, obviously, a communication network to coordinate an ecosystem of 40,000 different species of bacteria and 5 million species of fungi all working together. They have to communicate through a redox signaling environment. And so we discovered a family of molecules that exist in your human gut and in soil and all these organic environments to ignite this communication network. And it should have been obvious at the time, but it was shocking when we discovered it under the microscope that communication network from bacteria and fungi was dictating the production of the extracellular matrix from the human cell. And it makes sense. You've got bacteria and fungi living outside of the human cell, maintaining and dictating and recognizing what needs to be built in that extracellular environment. And then you've got mitochondria, the other microbiome, if you will, inside the cell, dictating what gets repaired and functioned and produced inside the human cell. And so now we've even proven that the bacteria and the fungi through this communication network can talk directly to the mitochondria. So holy cow, isn't that beautiful? You've got all of this ecosystem outside of you, talking to all of this ecosystem inside of you, coordinating human health, which means you are on purpose. You are wanted. You are loved. You are taken care of at the cellular level by billions and trillions of cells that are non-human that are taking care of you. there's 1.5 quadrillion bacteria, probably 10 times that many fungi, and there's 14 to 15 quadrillion mitochondria inside your cells. It's just, like you said, mind-blowing. The scale of your body and what happens within the cell, outside the cell, at the atomic level, these are truly atomic, not atomic physics, but astrophysics numbers. These are like universal, the scale of the universe to the planet Earth is actually mathematically the same distance between the single human cell and the atom. And so that gives you a sense of just how massive a single cell is compared to that atomic structure.
Yeah. And it kind of raises some very profound questions, which I don't particularly want to go into, but it does when you're describing all that with the cells.
Yeah.
And when you're looking at, under a microscope, a very high-powered microscope, how that resembles, the structure of the universe. And it's just fascinating that, the microbiome, the cells, and the mitochondria in the cells are all working together. And most importantly, as you said there beautifully, is they all love us. And
yes.
And which brings it back to the human side, because when you're talking about cells and mitochondria and redox and all this, it doesn't sound very human, but, so we are talking about, us humans and our health. And something else I read, I just want to slip that in because I thought about you, which was really fascinating too, is you said one of the things, I think it was on the McCullough interview, was that soils have an intelligence. And I thought that was excellent as well. But obviously they have an intelligence. Everything has an intelligence. Every living thing has an intelligence. But I want to just go back to what you're saying about the cancer there. Because so this glyphosate, but obviously it's not just like glyphosate, because you've identified that. And then there's the EMFs too, and it's not just the EMFs again, it's this perfect storm, it's all these things, it's lots of things, it's GMOs, it's, the chemicals from the soaps we put on our skin and the shampoos and all sorts, which are all working together. But one of the things that I was reading was that there was this correlation, you'd done this overlap between, on a glyphosate map, and an EMF map, I guess a cell tower map, and you got some, and so you overlaid the two, and there was a correlation with disease.
Yeah, you can see the shift. I think the cell phone tower data is kind of, I think, again, creating a perfect storm. The perfect overlay happens between the spraying of Roundup and glyphosate on our crops and where that ends up in our water system. 85% of all the Roundup that's sprayed in the United States ends up in the Mississippi River, and therefore has the highest concentrations in the last 90 miles of the Mississippi River, which runs from Baton Rouge to New Orleans, Louisiana. And that happens to be the highest rates of cancer in the whole world now. And that did not have our cancer risk 20 years ago. And so in 1995, the highest cancer rates in the United States were in the Northeast and the Northwest. And suddenly, over just a 20-year period, we put the highest risk of cancer into this deep South where it had never been before. And so we completely changed the demographics of cancer with the spraying of one single chemical.
Because people are drinking that water, so that water's treated, obviously, but you're saying, it goes into the subsoil and people are drinking.
So
you're ingesting
the water runoff from the farms that is carrying glyphosate, which unfortunately is a water-soluble toxin. Nature doesn't like water-soluble toxins. You think of like toxins in venom from spiders or other things, like these are fat-soluble toxins typically. So a water-soluble toxin is relatively unusual and is a bad news situation when you have an Earth, a planet that is made 70% from water, and a human body that's made 70% from water. That chemical is going to be able to travel everywhere. And so not only is it in the Mississippi River, that water evaporates, and 70% of the air samples taken around the river are full of glyphosate. 75% of the rainfall has glyphosate in it. And so the whole water ecosystem from the river to the clouds has Roundup in it. That's astonishing, astounding, terrifying when you see that chemical destroy the extracellular matrix, the fiber optic system, and you start to get this vulnerability to chronic disease. And so that's the astounding overlap. Now what you can do is you can overlap the cell phone towers with that map, and you can see that in city centers, you're gonna double down on the potential damage. And so this is, I think, where our inner city population gets hammered. Is, you know, our rural culture, I think, is more damaged by agricultural toxicity in our inner city environment, especially as we go to 5G. I assume that all of your listeners probably are very, very familiar with 5G as far as what the implications are from an infrastructure standpoint. But suddenly you go from a cell tower every 7 miles to a cell structure, emanating structure every block of a city center like New York. And so suddenly everybody in a building is getting exposed to very, very high levels of 5G radiation. And so that is kind of the slippery slope that I think where we can start to overlay the behaviors. But it goes beyond that, interestingly, too. When we start to think about the microbiome, if you overlay the map of physicians' number of prescriptions of antibiotics to their customers, you can see, again, a perfect correlation between cancer death and the number of prescriptions of antibiotics. And so the more antibiotics we prescribe, the more people die of cancer in that state.
Crazy world.
Yeah.
So let's talk about solutions. Let's try to be a little bit more optimistic, because there is optimism, obviously, and that's why you're doing this work, because you're looking for solutions, working on solutions, and there are solutions. And as I understand it, you treat people with electrical hypersensitivity, or people that have this electromagnetic field sensitivity. So can I ask you, what is your protocol? Perhaps firstly, in terms of direct, what I call direct EMF protection, in terms of perhaps shielding meters or tips that you give them with regard to these electromagnetic field emitting devices.
Perfect. Yeah. So in our clinic, my clinic is called the M Clinic. It's in Charlottesville, Virginia, and we're building a network of these clinics across the country now. And the clinic model is very much like you would picture a regenerative agricultural biodynamic farm. If you want to grow healthy plants for the consumer, you got to grow healthy soil. That's now our realization on the human side, is if you want a healthy human, you've got to go and rebuild the organic soil within and around that human, which means you need to rebuild the biochemistry of the microbiome. And so that's where we've been for the last 5 years. We've been doing science and bringing to market solutions around this microbiome communication network that we kind of uncovered in 2012. And so we've been working on understanding the role, not of the bacteria per se, or the fungi, but their communication network on regenerating and rejuvenating this organic environment for our cells to stew in and live within. And the exciting thing that we are seeing again and again under the microscope is that with enough information from the microbiome, the human cell knows exactly how to repair the extracellular matrix despite the damage of Roundup and other chemicals and pharmaceuticals. We've shown that we can reverse and prevent that damage by just getting the microbiome back into the human system. So the extraordinary message here is that Mother Nature is more full of grace than we could possibly imagine. Here we are killing Mother Nature with every technology that seems to come out, and yet her solutions are bigger than the problems we create if we allow them back in. And so it's recognizing Mother Nature's miracles and recognizing Mother Nature's gifts that is allowing our clinics to really become, cutting edge outcomes in a lot of different conditions, because we stop treating the diseases. In my clinic, we don't care if you come in with acne or cancer, we're going to do the same thing. We're going to go rebuild your soil. Because if you have healthy soil, it's going to create healthy communication for an extracellular matrix that's intact. And you get an extracellular matrix intact, your fiber optic cables work, you're communicating across cell membranes. All of the machinery that we're talking about in the Newtonian world suddenly turns on, and you repair yourself. You don't need a doctor, you don't need a drug, you don't need anything, you just repair. And so we run an online 8-week intensive program for patients around the world now that teaches them these fundamentals of rebuilding the human body at the fundamentals. And that 8-week program, called the Intrinsic Health Series, is named such with the realization that there's intrinsic health in your body. It does not come from a pill, it doesn't come from a bottle. Everything that we do from a supplement standpoint, if it's not supporting that intrinsic health, then we're wasting our time. You're wasting your money if your supplements aren't directly proven to show that it's supporting that intrinsic mechanism of cell repair and rejuvenation.
Yeah. And so there is this intrinsic intelligence, and your work is to help Mother Nature, as you call it, all this, intrinsic intelligence, be it Mother Nature, be it the universe, call it what you want, but this force that there is, which obviously when you're looking down the microscope, the superpowered microscope, that's what we're seeing is this vacuum.
Yeah.
And this energy. So speak to me about, if you can please, in concrete terms, the kind of things, the kind of strategies in this 8-week course, the kind of thing that people will be doing. And does that include, actual tips in terms of, not using a cell phone and not having Wi-Fi, etc.?
Yeah, we can get at that to some. Again, it begins in the microbiome, and then we move into human nutrition and how it supports the microbiome, which then supports the human nutrient system. So nutrition is a big piece of it. We focus a lot on hydration and mechanisms of hydrating the inside of the cell for detoxification. All of these detox methods that are pushed in the alternative world really don't work that well if you're not hydrated. And so you got to get hydration as your primary piece there. We teach people how to breathe. We teach them how to exercise. We teach them how to do all these things that are fundamental in human health that bizarrely are never taught in school systems to our children, are never taught in our school systems as doctors, therefore is never taught in exam rooms across the world. We literally are missing the fundamental building blocks of how human health happens. And so that's what the 8-week program is really about. Every single client that goes through the program is paired with a one-on-one coach to help them start to integrate this, because in the end, it's a pretty big lifestyle reformation that has to happen to move somebody from point A of being part of the industrial consumer world to an intrinsic healing machine. That has to do entirely with how do you live your day-to-day life, minute to minute. What are the decisions you make in a grocery store? What's the decisions you make in the way in which you create your environment in your office or your home? And that, of course, includes, where's the EMF? How do you ameliorate EMF? How do you stay grounded, to create that Faraday cage? How do you create, barrier systems within the body at the cell level, magnesium and other tools there. So there's lots and lots of layers that we kind of teach over those 8 weeks to get people resilient there. But the main mission of the program is not just to create biologic health. It's there to create human health. And humanity is an intrinsically creative, on-purpose species. We are not happy just doing what every other human does. The unique thing about our species, much different than if you look at antelopes or lions or any other species in the macro mammal world out there, they all do the same thing. They all hunt the same way. They eat the same way. They all perform the same function within the environment. The bizarre thing about humans is we all showed up here to do something different. I do something very unique to my children or my spouse or to my coworkers. I am so super hyper specialized at every level. And that makes us very unique as a species. And so this is actually what the 8-week intensive program is about, is let's get the biology working so well that you're no longer spending 99% of your energy on repair, and you can start putting 99% of your energy into being on purpose. What are you here to do? What is the creativity that's supposed to flow out of you from your unique perspective within this human tapestry? What are you here to do? How can we invigorate that? And that's where these one-on-one coaches are just so empowering.
That's the word was coming to me, which you just said at the end there, empowering. So it's about empowering people. And it is, so the microbiome is at the center of this. But then it's like just because people listening to you at the beginning, then it does sound incredibly complicated when you're talking about the mitochondria and this extracellular matrix and the cells and all this.
Yeah.
But then when you actually get down to, okay, but what do we do? What do we do about it? What are the solutions? Well, actually, the solutions in the main are just kind of everyday things in large part.
Yeah.
And one of the things,
for a large part, blindingly obvious.
Blindingly obvious. But it seems as though we need to go through this whole understanding, breaking it down, looking under the high-powered microscope again, looking at the cells and marveling at what there is there, this nothingness of what there is there, to get back to some very kind of basic health advice, really. And maybe I'm overstating it a little bit.
No, you're not at all. You're not at all. And I think, there's reason for that as well. I mean, number one, humans are very analytical beings. And so there's part of that knowingness that's important for us. But further than that, you can't really find the solution until you know the problem. And so I think that's a lot of why we have had to break it down to its fundamentals and really explore the atomic physics and the biophysics and the cell biology and the biochemistry. All of that has just been to define the playing field of what human health looks like so that we can start to foster support systems for it. And nutrition is a good example of this. You would think that since every single human being on earth has to eat to survive, we would know a hell of a lot about eating and nutrition. Well, we know absolutely nothing about eating and nutrition. That's why you can go online and find 32 conflicting diets that all say you're going to die if you don't do this nutrition. And yet they all disagree and they're all flying in the face of each other. Like, that's how confused we are on the very basics of human health. We don't even know how to eat. Then you look at hydration, you would think, my God, water is more important than food. We can't survive for more than a week, maybe 4 or 5 days without water. We don't even know how to drink water such that it would actually get inside a human cell. We end up peeing out the vast majority of water that we consume before it ever touches the inside of a human cell to actually do its work. And so it's taken me as a physician and scientist these years to untangle all of the minutia to realize, oh my God, the reason why we're so sick is we are not doing a single thing right. We literally don't walk correctly. We don't breathe correctly. We don't exercise correctly. We don't hydrate correctly. We don't eat correctly. We are literally idiots on the level of life. When it comes to human life, human health, we do not know what that looks like as physicians and scientists and consumers. We are starting to crack the code on some of that, but I think we are at the very tip of the iceberg. We know that we should all be living to 120 years or beyond because the cell biology shows us that we have that kind of longevity potential. It's clear that we are scratching the potential of human life, which means that we're scratching the potential of human consciousness, which has to be the truth. Because if you look at our political policies, our political behavior these days, it's so disgusting. It's so broken. It's so dark, ultimately. And we are in such conflict as a species. You don't see conflict like this in any other part of the universe. We are in such conflict right now because we're not nearly at the 1% of our own potential. So that's both the sad reality and the extremely exciting reality of the future, which is, what if we bond together as human beings and say, let's solve this through the fundamentals of human health so that human consciousness can rise and overcome the broken, extremely consumptive social and consumer behavior that we have right now, and create not just sustainable, but actually regenerative behaviors at the political, social, consumer, business levels. And then we will see major shifts happen at a level that's never existed in human history. And it has to happen that way. We are on trajectory to become sterile as a species in the next 30 to 50 years. Stop being able to procreate, we die and go extinct. That won't even be that sad of a story on the biology level, because we've extincted to the level of never coming back on this planet 40% of life on the planet in the last 50 years. 40% of life on the planet is gone and will never come back, and we might be the next ones to go.
And it starts by you, me, everybody just taking action.
Simple, straightforward action. Get back into nature. That would be my mandate to all of you listening. How can you possibly help right now? Get outside and hike, look at the nature around you, and figure out how you can get more integrated into that. How can you redesign your home so that Mother Nature is more a part of the intra-home environment? What is the air you breathe? Is the air you're breathing cleaned by an air conditioning system that's got everything filtered out of it? Or do you have windows open? Are you breathing the outside world? When you jump in your car, are you breathing off-gassing plastic, or are your windows down? Are you breathing the outside world? These are just fundamentally basic things. When you put something on your plate, was any of that grown in your backyard? If not, it needs to be. Have you touched a plant recently? Have you had your shoes off and walked in grass recently? Have you experienced the joy of running down a hillside of grass and wildflowers recently? These are the fundamental joys that most of us are lacking. And if you start doing that, you will change the course of humanity. Just do those little things with me and with all of us, and we are going to change it. It's inevitable. Once you start to plug into nature, once you start to get healthier, once you actually feel younger next year than you did 10 years ago, that changes the equation in your head. Because right now we are in a consumer behavior, because it's like, well, we're all going to die anyways. Everybody's dying of cancer anyways, so I might as well smoke, drink, and be happy. Well, no, if it doesn't have to be that way, you can actually get stronger and more resilient and more full of intellectual prowess, intellectual interest over the next 5 years than you did in the last 10. Now that changes everything you do. Like, okay, I need to invest in the future because I can get better, not weaker.
Yeah. You're just inspiring me. I just stood here listening to you, and it's a fantastic message. It's an extraordinary message. I'm so happy to have had you as a guest. Your work is amazing. It really is. Mother Nature, love, and we're back to that. We're back to these fundamentals, which we just can't forget. And we're in a world that seems to be going crazy, but it's for each one of us to sit up, wake up, listen, and act on this information, because this is really great information. So perhaps you could just remind people where they can find more about what you do, please.
Sure. My kind of education website and kind of the portal into a lot of the different things I do is at zachbushmd.com, ZACHBUSHMD.com. The science around the microbiome and the soil science that we talked about, the dietary supplements that have come out of there, that's all available at the website. Restore, RESTORE, the number 4, life.com, restoreforlife.com. Can get you all of that science. There's an innumerable podcasts and YouTube videos of a lot of my lectures and everything else. If you jump on YouTube and search Zach Bush, you'll find a ton of material there as well. So it's kind of ubiquitous at this point. If you want to go down the rabbit hole, you can spend the next 3 weeks listening to all of our material and really delve in deep. But we look forward to you being a part of this, because as a consumer of this podcast, and your mindset came in around electromagnetic fields, and I hope we blew up that model to be a mindset of the planet and the universe itself. How are you involved in that? What is your purpose here? Once you get this information, I find over and over again that you are a changed person. The people that I watch now with this information, they often will become even more fluid and efficacious in the education mission than I can even become. So you guys are now ripple effects. I trust that the truths that you've heard today are almost like those things that at tomorrow's dinner party or around the water cooler tomorrow, you can't help but start to talk about it. Like you just learned something mind-blowing. You can't help but start to share that with your family, friends, coworkers, etc. And that's what needs to happen. That's why I'm on so many of these podcasts, is because I already see that the electrical media, this wireless communication happening through the internet and through this kind of grassroots media is so much more relevant and powerful and important than anything you're going to pick up from CNN or any of these mass media environments that are just, talking heads for the current paradigm. So the new paradigm, the future of health, if we're going to create it, is going to come through you being a part of this massive grassroots effort of education, self-awareness, and really you stepping into your purpose. So thanks for being a part of Lloyd's community here. I'm really thrilled to be a part of your community now, and I look forward to seeing your impact on the world around you. Thanks for what you do.
Thank you so much, Dr. Zach Bush. So thank you so much for being part of the EMF Health Summit, really. And for all of you who have joined us today, thanks for being part of this movement. Stay tuned for the next session. My name is Lloyd Borrell. Thanks a lot. Take care.